The tea my daughter-in-law made always tasted strange, bitter. One night, I left it untouched on the table. By morning, my grandson, innocent and pure, sipped it instead and collapsed. The hospital reports told the truth. Poison. Police. Handcuffs. My son fell to his knees begging, but it was too late. They drank the same karma they tried to feed me. Before we dive into this story of betrayal, poison, and the most twisted justice you've ever witnessed, please subscribe to Justice Tales and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, this one will leave you questioning everyone who's ever made you a cup of tea. My name is Dorothy Chen, and at 74 years old, I thought I understood the depths of human cruelty. I was wrong. The most evil betrayal of my life came from the people who sat at my dinner table every Sunday, who called me MOM and Grandma, who smiled at me while slowly poisoning me to death. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, back when I still believed that sharing blood meant sharing loyalty, and that a mother's love would always be returned by her children. I'd lived in my house in San Francisco's Sunset District for 37 years. My husband James and I bought it in 1985 when our son Kevin was 12 and our daughter Amy was 10. Back then, it was a modest two-story Victorian that needed work, but we saw potential where others saw problems. Over 3 decades, James and I transformed that house into something beautiful. We restored the original hardwood floors, updated the kitchen with custom cabinets James built himself, and converted the attic into a reading room where I spent countless hours with books and afternoon tea. When James died from cancer 4 years ago, that house became more than just my home. It became my connection to 37 years of marriage, my sanctuary for grieving, and the place where I intended to live out my remaining years, surrounded by memories of the life we'd built together. But it also became something else in the eyes of my family. A valuable piece of real estate worth approximately $1.2 million in San Francisco's insane housing market. Kevin, now 49, and married to a woman named Linda who worked as a pharmaceutical technician, had been making increasingly obvious comments about my living situation since James's funeral. "Emma, this house is getting too big for you to manage alone," he'd say during his weekly visits, usually while Linda wandered through the rooms with calculating eyes. "Have you thought about something smaller? Maybe a nice condo or assisted living community?" Assisted living, the polite way of suggesting that a widow should give up her family home so her adult children could cash out on their inheritance while she was still alive to see them spend it. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own home, Kevin. Your father and I designed the layout to be accessible as we aged, and I have all the support services I need. But what about safety? What if you fell down those stairs? What if there was a medical emergency and you were here alone? What if? What if? What if?" The constant drumbeat of manufactured fears designed to make me doubt my own competence and accept that I needed supervision. Linda would nod sympathetically during these conversations. Friends my own age, her voice as if my 74 years made me incapable of maintaining Kevin and I just worry about you rattling around in this big house all by yourself. We've seen such lovely retirement communities where you can make friends your
now
own
47
age
and married to a man named
Robert,
Robert who ran a struggling consulting business, took a more subtle approach.
Instead of questioning my ability to live alone, she questioned my decision-making abilities. Yesterday when I called, you seemed confused about your medication schedule," she'd say, her voice filled with manufactured worry. "I wasn't confused about my medications, Amy. I was reorganizing my pill organizer and checking with my pharmacist about potential interactions. But you asked me to repeat what I'd said about Dad's anniversary, because you were talking while I was concentrating on something important, and I wanted to make sure I understood what you were planning." "Maybe, but you've seemed a little scattered lately, more forgetful about details." Forgetful, the magic word that adult children use to justify taking control of their parents' lives. If MOM is getting forgetful, then clearly she needs help making important decisions, like whether to sell her house and move into a facility. By spring of 2023, both Kevin and Amy were making regular comments about my supposed decline in mental sharpness and my inability to manage my household safely. None of their concerns were based on evidence. I was paying my bills on time, maintaining my home properly, driving safely, and managing my medical care without any assistance. But they were building a narrative, creating a foundation for arguments they planned to make later about why I needed to give up my independence and accept their control over my living situation and finances. The campaign intensified after what they dramatically called the Dizzy Spell incident. I'd been working in my garden on a warm Saturday morning in June, weeding the flower beds and watering the roses James had planted for me 15 years earlier. I'd been outside for about 3 hours when I started feeling lightheaded and nauseous. I came inside, drank some water, and sat down in my kitchen until the dizziness passed. Within 20 minutes, I felt completely normal and went back to my gardening. I didn't think much of it. Mild dehydration and overexertion were common problems for anyone working outside in the heat, especially someone my age. But when Kevin arrived that evening for one of his unannounced visits, he immediately noticed that I seemed tired. "Mom, are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." "I spent too much time in the garden this morning and got overheated. Nothing serious, just needed to cool down and hydrate." The expression that crossed Kevin's face wasn't concern, it was something closer to satisfaction, as if I'd just provided him with exactly the ammunition he'd been waiting for. "You had a dizzy spell, Mom. That could be a sign of serious health problems. Low blood pressure, heart issues, medication side effects." "It was mild dehydration, Kevin. I've been gardening for 40 years, and I know the difference between heat exhaustion and medical emergencies." "But what if it had been something more serious? What if you'd collapsed outside where no one could find you for hours? What if? Again, within 2 days, I was fielding phone calls from both of my children, their spouses, and even my primary care physician, all expressing their deep concern about my dizzy spell and their belief that it indicated I could no longer live alone safely. Dr. Martinez, who'd been my physician for 12 years, called me directly. "Mrs. Chin, your son Kevin contacted me about an episode of dizziness you experienced while gardening. He's concerned that it might indicate cardiovascular problems or medication issues." Kevin had been recruiting my own doctor to support his narrative about my declining health and my need for supervision. "Dr. Martinez, I spent 3 hours working in 90-degree heat and got mildly dehydrated. It's not a medical mystery." "Of course not, but at your age, we need to be cautious about any symptoms that could indicate underlying problems." Kevin mentioned that you've also been having some memory issues and confusion about daily tasks. Memory issues and confusion that existed only in Kevin's imagination and his need to justify what I was beginning to realize was a systematic campaign to have me declared about my declining capabilities. The evaluation took place over 2 visits and included blood work, heart monitoring, balance tests, and a cognitive assessment that felt more like an interrogation than a medical examination. "Mrs. Chun, I'm going to ask you some questions to assess your mental sharpness," said Dr. Martinez during the second visit. "These are routine tests we do for all patients your age." The questions were designed to identify cognitive decline, but they were administered in a way that suggested Dr. Martinez had already decided what he was going to find. When I answered questions correctly, he frowned as if my accuracy was surprising. When I asked for clarification about ambiguous questions, he noted that I seemed confused by simple instructions. When I explained the reasoning behind my answers, he observed that I was overcompensating for memory problems by providing excessive detail. The whole evaluation felt like a setup, and the results confirmed my suspicions. "Mrs. Chern, while your physical health is generally good for someone your age, I do have some concerns about cognitive changes that might affect your ability to live independently safely." "What kind of cognitive changes?" "Some memory issues, mild confusion about complex tasks, and what appears to be reduced awareness of safety risks, as evidenced by your recent dizzy spell incident." Reduced awareness of safety risks because I'd gotten overheated while gardening and hadn't immediately recognized it as a medical emergency requiring professional intervention. "I'm going to recommend that you consider having additional support with daily activities, and I think your family's concerns about your living situation are worth taking seriously." Dr. Martinez's report was exactly what Kevin had been waiting for. Professional medical documentation that I was experiencing cognitive decline that made independent living potentially dangerous. Kevin wasted no time in using the report to escalate his campaign against my independence. "Mom, Dr. Martinez says you're showing signs of memory problems and poor judgment about safety issues. We can't ignore medical advice from someone who's known you for over a decade." Dr. Martinez asked me loaded
Every normal
questions designed
aspect
to
of
make
aging
normal
was being
aging
reframed
processes
as
look
evidence
like
of
dementia
incompetence.
symptoms. Every time I pushed back
you're not
against their
qualified to
suggestions,
evaluate the medical
I was
assessment
demonstrating
of a
my
trained
lack of
physician.
insight
The
into
fact
my
that
own
you're dismissing
limitations.
his concerns
Every medical
proves that
issue,
you lack
no
insight
matter how
into your
minor,
own
was the
condition.
proof that I couldn't manage my health safely. By 4, the pressure from Kevin, Linda, Amy, and Robert was constant and coordinated. They'd begun having family meetings without me to discuss my own situation and the best approaches for convincing me to accept their help.
I knew this because Linda started making mistakes referring to conversations I hadn't been part of, mentioning decisions we had made about my care, and slipping up about plans they'd discussed for managing my transition to assisted living.
Mrs. Chen,
Linda said during one of their visits,
we've been researching some really nice facilities in the area that specialize in supporting seniors who are experiencing memory challenges.
We've been researching, not Kevin and I thought you might be interested in, but we've been researching as if my living situation was a family project that everyone was working on together.
What kind of facilities?
Well, there's Sunset Gardens, which has different levels of care depending on your needs. And Golden Years Manor has a wonderful program for people dealing with early-stage cognitive decline.
Early-stage cognitive decline, based on one episode of heat exhaustion and a biased medical evaluation. I'd apparently been diagnosed with dementia and was being presented with residential treatment options.
I'm not interested in moving to any kind of care facility.
But Amy chimed in. You need to think about this practically.
What happens when your condition gets worse?
Wouldn't it be better to make the transition while you're still able to participate in the decision? While you're still able to participate in the decision, as if my competence to make choices about my own life was temporary and diminishing.
The most disturbing part of their campaign wasn't the pressure itself, it was how they'd coordinated their approach to make it seem like independent medical professionals, concerned neighbors, and loving family members had all arrived at the same conclusion about my declining abilities.
But I was beginning to suspect that the decline they were documenting wasn't natural aging or early dementia. It started with the tea.
Linda had begun a routine of making me herbal tea during their visits, always insisting that I drink it while it was hot for maximum health benefits.
Mrs. Chen,
I brought you some special chamomile blend that's supposed to be excellent for relaxation and sleep quality. My pharmacist recommended it specifically for seniors who are dealing with stress.
The tea always tasted slightly bitter, with an aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly. When I mentioned this to Linda, she explained that high-quality herbal teas often had complex flavors that took time to appreciate.
It's an acquired taste, but the health benefits are worth it.
My pharmacist says the bitter compounds are actually the most therapeutic part. After drinking Linda's tea, I'd invariably feel tired and slightly disoriented for the rest of the evening.
Linda would comment sympathetically about how exhausted I looked and how the mental effort of our conversations seemed to be draining for me.
Mrs. Chen, you seem so fatigued lately. Are you getting enough rest? Are you eating properly? Sometimes seniors don't realize when they're not taking adequate care of themselves. Not taking adequate care of themselves. Another way of saying that I was too mentally impaired to recognize my own needs.
The pattern became more obvious over time. Linda's visits always included tea.
The tea always tasted bitter. I always felt foggy and tired afterward.
Linda always commented on how confused or exhausted I seemed. By November, I was beginning to suspect that Linda's concern for my health and her herbal tea recommendations weren't as innocent as they appeared. I decided to test my theory.
On a Tuesday evening, when Kevin and Linda came for dinner, Linda prepared her usual cup of special tea for me, emphasizing how important it was for my sleep quality and overall health. But instead of drinking it, I excused myself to use the bathroom and poured the tea into a small glass bottle I'd hidden in my purse.
I filled the teacup with regular chamomile tea from my own supply and returned to the living room.
This batch tastes different, I commented as I sipped the normal tea. Less bitter than usual.
Linda looked surprised and slightly concerned.
Really?
I made it exactly the same way I always do.
Maybe your taste buds are changing. That happens sometimes as people age. That night, I didn't experience the usual fatigue and disorientation that followed Linda's tea service. I slept normally. Results came back 5 days later and spent the next day and they confirmed my worst fears while providing evidence that would ultimately destroy the people who'd been systematically poisoning me.
Mrs. Chen, said Dr. Patricia Williams, the toxicologist who'd analyzed my tea sample. This sample contains significant levels of diphenhydramine and dextromethorphan compounds found in over-the-counter sleep aids and cough medicines. What would those compounds do to someone who consumed them regularly?
In the concentrations we found, they would cause drowsiness, confusion, memory problems, dizziness, and disorientation. Long-term exposure could lead to more serious cognitive impairment and potentially dangerous interactions with other medications.
Drowsiness, confusion, memory problems, dizziness. Every symptom that Kevin, Linda, Amy, and Robert had been attributing to my age and declining health had actually been caused by drugs they were putting in my tea.
Is this amount dangerous? It's not immediately lethal, but it's definitely harmful, especially for someone your age.
These compounds can cause falls, accidents, and serious medical complications when used without medical supervision. What's particularly concerning is that someone clearly intended to impair your cognitive function without your knowledge.
What should I do with this information?
You should contact the police immediately.
What you're describing is a clear case of poisoning with intent to cause harm.
This isn't a medical issue, it's a criminal matter. That afternoon, I called the San Francisco Police Department and reported that I'd been systematically poisoned by my family members over a period of several months.
Detective James Rodriguez, who specialized in elder abuse cases, came to my house that evening to take my statement and collect the evidence I'd gathered.
Mrs. Chen, this is one of the most calculated elder abuse cases I've ever encountered.
Your family has been deliberately impairing your cognitive function to build a case for having you declared incompetent. What's my next step? We need to document everything they've done and gather evidence
Linda's
of their
expression
ongoing
showed immediate interest. Another dizzy spell? Mrs. Chen, that's the third one this month. I think we really need to talk to Dr. Martinez about adjusting your medications.
Maybe some tea will help, Kevin suggested, right on cue.
Linda brought that chamomile blend you like so much.
That's sweet of you, dear, I said, watching Linda move efficiently around my kitchen, measuring herbs and preparing what I now knew was a carefully calculated dose of cognitive impairing drugs. This batch is a little stronger than usual, Linda explained as she heated the water.
My pharmacist friend suggested increasing the concentration to help with your sleep problems. Increasing the concentration. She was escalating the dosage, probably because the previous amounts hadn't been creating the level of impairment they needed to justify their intervention in my life. I watched Linda add what appeared to be a small paper packet of white powder to my teacup powder that the hidden cameras were recording, and that would later be identified as a concentrated mixture of the same drugs found in my previous tea sample.
Here you go, Mrs. Chen.
Drink it while it's hot for maximum benefit. I accepted the cup and raised it to my lips, but didn't actually drink any of the poison tea.
Thank you, dear. It smells lovely. For the next hour, Kevin and Linda went through their usual routine of discussing my health concerns, my living situation, and their recommendations for increased medical supervision and possible residential care.
MOM, Linda and I have been talking to Amy and Robert, and we all agree that it's time to seriously consider some assisted living options. Your dizzy spells are getting more frequent, and you seem more confused during our conversations. I don't feel confused, I said, still holding the untouched teacup.
But that's exactly the problem, Linda said with full sympathy. People experiencing cognitive decline often don't recognize their own symptoms.
That's why family members need to step in and make difficult decisions. Difficult decisions, like having me declared incompetent, so they could sell my house and control my assets. When they prepared to leave, Linda noticed that my teacup was still nearly full. Mrs. Chen, you barely touch your tea.
It's important to drink the whole cup to get the full therapeutic benefit.
I'll finish it after you leave, I promised, knowing that the tea would be going straight down my kitchen sink once they're carpooled away from my curb. After they left, I poured the poison tea into evidence containers that Detective Rodriguez had provided, sealed them according to his instructions, and called to report that we'd successfully documented another poisoning attempt.
Excellent work, Mrs. Chen. The video footage shows Linda clearly adding an unknown substance to your tea, and the audio recording captures her acknowledging that this batch was stronger than usual. Combined with your tea sample and the toxicology report, we have overwhelming evidence of systematic poisoning.
What happens next?
We arrest them.
Tomorrow morning, before they have a chance to dispose of evidence or coordinate their stories.
But Karma had other plans. The arrests were scheduled for Wednesday morning, but on Tuesday night, less than 24 hours after Kevin and Linda had tried to poison me with an increased dosage of cognitive impairing drugs, something happened that turned their crime into a family tragedy they'd never recover from.
My grandson Tyler, Kevin and Linda's 8-year-old son, had spent Tuesday night at my house. Tyler had been asking to have a sleepover at Grandma's house for months, and I'd finally agreed. Partly because I missed spending time with him, and partly because I wanted to create some normal family memories before the criminal charges destroyed our relationships permanently.
Tyler was a bright, energetic boy who reminded me so much of his father at that age before Kevin had become someone who would poison his own mother for money. We'd had a wonderful evening together. I'd made his favorite dinner. We'd watched animated movies, and I'd read him stories before tucking him into the guest bedroom where his father had slept as a child. Wednesday morning, Tyler woke up early and came downstairs while I was still getting dressed. He was always an independent child, comfortable in my house and capable of getting himself a drink or snack if he was hungry.
What I didn't know was that I'd left Linda's poison tea sitting on my kitchen counter.
I'd been so focused on preserving it as evidence that I'd forgotten to pour it down the sink after Kevin and Linda left.
The teacup was still sitting exactly where Linda had placed it, filled with what looked like harmless herbal tea, but was actually a concentrated mixture of drugs that could seriously harm an adult and could kill a child.
Tyler, thirsty and thinking he was being helpful by cleaning up after his visit, saw the teacup and drank the entire contents.
I found him 20 minutes later, collapsed on my kitchen floor, unconscious and barely breathing. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes of my 911 call, but those 8 minutes felt like hours as I watched my grandson's lips turn blue and his breathing become more and more shallow.
What did he ingest? The lead paramedic asked as they worked to stabilize Tyler's vital signs. I think he drank tea that was meant for me, I said, my voice breaking as I realized the full horror of what had happened.
Tea that my daughter-in-law made for me last night.
What kind of tea? It was poisoned, I whispered, the words sounding surreal even as I spoke them.
My daughter-in-law has been poisoning me, and my grandson accidentally drank it. The paramedic's expression changed from routine emergency response to something much more serious. Ma'am, we need to know exactly what substances were in that tea.
Do you have any information about what your daughter-in-law might have used?
I gave them Detective Rodriguez's contact information and explained about the ongoing investigation into my systematic
By the
poisoning.
time Tyler was loaded into the ambulance, Detective Rodriguez was already coordinating with hospital toxicologists to analyze Tyler's blood and determine exactly what Linda had put in my tea the previous evening.
At the hospital, Tyler was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit in critical condition. The concentrated dose of diphenhydramine and dextromethorphan that Linda had prepared for me, calculated to impair an adult's cognitive function, was potentially lethal for a child Tyler's size.
Kevin and Linda arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes of my call, and their reaction to seeing Tyler unconscious and connected to life support machines was the moment when the full weight of their actions finally hit them. What happened? Kevin demanded, his voice shaking with panic and disbelief.
Tyler was fine when we left him here last night.
Tyler drank the tea Linda made for me, I said quietly.
The tea she's been using to poison me for months. Linda's face went completely white.
Her legs gave out, and she had to grab Kevin's arm to keep from collapsing. No, she whispered. No, that's not.
He couldn't have.
The tea was for me, I finished. But Tyler found it this morning and drank it, thinking it was regular chamomile tea.
Kevin looked back and forth between Linda and me, and I could see the moment when he realized that his wife's herbal tea therapy had actually been systematic poisoning, and that their son was now fighting for his life because of it.
Linda, what did you put in that tea?
He asked, his voice barely audible. It was just.
I was trying to help your mother sleep better. What did you put in the tea? Kevin screamed, loud enough that hospital security started moving in our direction.
Diphenhydramine and dextromethorphan, Detective Rodriguez said, appearing in the waiting room with 2 uniformed officers.
The same substances she's been using to poison your mother for months, but in concentrated doses that are extremely dangerous for children.
Linda started crying, not the fake tears she'd used during her performance as the concerned daughter-in-law, but the real, devastating tears of someone who'd just realized that her criminal conspiracy had nearly killed an innocent child. I didn't mean for Tyler to drink it, she sobbed.
It was never supposed to hurt him. I would never hurt Tyler.
But you were willing to hurt me, I said, looking at this woman who'd sat at my dinner table, called me a moem, and systematically poisoned me while pretending to care about my health. The trial began
Mrs.
9
Chen.
months later, and it became one of the most closely watched elder abuse cases in California history.
The combination of systematic poisoning, family betrayal, and the tragic irony of the perpetrator's own child becoming the victim created a story that captivated national media attention.
Linda's defense team tried to argue that she'd been attempting to help me with sleep problems and anxiety, that the substances she'd added to my tea were therapeutic rather than harmful,
and that Tyler's overdose had been a tragic accident rather than evidence of criminal intent. That argument crumbled when the prosecution presented expert testimony about the specific drugs Linda had been using and their effects on elderly people. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," said Dr. Sarah Martinez, a toxicologist from UCSF, "the defendant used compounds specifically chosen to impair cognitive function while avoiding immediate detection. These weren't therapeutic doses, they were carefully calculated amounts designed to create symptoms that would support claims of mental decline."
How do you know the dosing was calculated rather than accidental?
Because the defendant is a pharmaceutical technician with professional knowledge of drug interactions and dosing protocols.
She knew exactly what effects these substances would have on Mrs.
Churn, and she knew how to disguise their administration as harmless herbal tea.
Linda's pharmaceutical background, which Kevin had initially thought made her qualified to help with my health concerns, had actually made her the perfect person to commit sophisticated medical fraud.
The prosecution also presented evidence that Linda had been researching the effects of various over-the-counter medications on elderly people for months before she began poisoning me. Her internet search history showed queries about making elderly people confused, drugs that cause memory loss, and medications that make people seem demented.
She hadn't stumbled into poisoning me, she'd researched it methodically and implemented it strategically.
Kevin's defense was even weaker.
His lawyers tried to claim that he'd been genuinely concerned about my mental state and had no knowledge of Linda's poisoning activities.
But the prosecution showed that Kevin had been actively participating in documenting my supposed decline, coordinating with Dr. Martinez to create medical records that supported claims of incompetence, and working with real estate agents to prepare for the sale of my house.
Mr. Harrison may not have known about the specific drugs his wife was administering, the prosecutor argued, but he was an active participant in a conspiracy to rob his mother of her independence and her assets. He used the symptoms created by his wife's poisoning to justify taking control of Mrs. Chen's life.
Amy and Robert received lighter sentences because their participation had been less direct.
But they were still convicted of conspiracy and elder abuse for their roles in pressuring me to accept assisted living and supporting Kevin and Linda's narrative about my declining
mental state. The most
state.
devastating testimony came from Tyler himself, who was now 9 years old and had recovered completely from his poisoning but understood that his mother had been doing something terrible to his grandmother.
"My mom always made special tea for Grandma," Tyler told the court, his small voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom.
"She said it was medicine tea that would help Grandma feel better."
"Did your mother ever tell you not to drink the tea she made for Grandma?"
"Yes.
She said it was special medicine just for old people, and that it would make me sick if I drank it."
"But you drank it the morning you got sick."
"I was thirsty, and I thought it was just regular tea."
"It tasted really bad, but I drank it anyway because I didn't want Grandma to think I was wasting her tea."
Tyler's testimony broke hearts throughout the courtroom, but it also provided the final piece of evidence that Linda had known exactly what she was doing and had been aware that her poison could harm children.
The jury deliberated for 6 hours.
Linda was convicted of attempted murder in the first degree for both Tyler and me, plus child endangerment, elder abuse, conspiracy, and illegal distribution of controlled substances.
She was sentenced to 25 years in state prison. Kevin was convicted of conspiracy to commit elder abuse and fraud.
He was sentenced to 8 years in state prison and permanently lost custody of Tyler.
Amy was convicted of conspiracy and elder abuse.
She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison. Robert was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to 3 years in state prison. All 4 were ordered to pay restitution covering Tyler's medical expenses, my medical care, detective costs, and legal fees.
The total exceeded $200,000, which none of them could pay from prison.
More importantly, they were permanently barred from any contact with Tyler or me, and from any inheritance rights related to my estate.
Tyler was placed in foster care with a family that understood the trauma he'd experienced and the complex emotions of having his mother imprisoned for trying to kill his grandmother. The hardest part of the entire experience was knowing that Tyler had lost both of his parents, one to prison and one to the consequences of choices that had destroyed their family forever. But Tyler was resilient, intelligent, and surrounded by people who were committed to helping him heal from the trauma while maintaining connections to the positive memories he had of our family before it was destroyed by greed and betrayal. The foster family allowed me to maintain regular contact with Tyler, and I became something between a grandmother and a friend, someone who could provide stability and love without the complicated emotions of biological family relationships that had been poisoned by criminal
Today,
behavior.
3 years after Linda nearly killed both Tyler and me with her poison tea, I'm still living in my house on 42nd Avenue.
But the house has been transformed from a target of family greed into a headquarters for protecting elderly people from the kinds of betrayal I experienced.
The Dorothy Chun Foundation for Elder Protection operates from my converted attic, providing resources, legal assistance,
and emotional support for elderly Americans who are being targeted by family members who want to control their assets or living situations.
Our first major project was developing a comprehensive database of warning signs that indicate when family members might be planning financial or physical abuse against elderly relatives.
The database includes red flags like sudden concerns about mental competence that aren't supported by medical evidence, coordinated pressure from multiple family members about living situations, manufactured safety incidents, and gradual isolation from friends and independent support systems. But our most important work involves helping elderly people document suspicious behavior and protect themselves before abuse escalates to the level I experienced.
We've provided grants for security systems to over 300 elderly people who suspected their families were planning to abuse them.
17 of those cases resulted in criminal prosecutions when the cameras documented theft, fraud, or physical abuse.
We've also provided legal assistance to elderly people fighting family members who were trying to have them declared incompetent, helping them gather evidence and expert testimony that proved their continued mental competence.
The Foundation's work has been featured in documentaries about elder abuse, discussed in academic papers about family financial crimes, and used by lawmakers to develop stronger legal protections for vulnerable seniors.
But for me, the most meaningful aspect of the Foundation's work is the personal transformation it's made possible in my own life. Instead of spending my remaining years isolated by fear and suspicion, I'm surrounded by a community of people who understand that family relationships should be based on mutual respect rather than financial opportunity.
That elderly people deserve dignity and autonomy regardless of their age or health status, and that betrayal by loved ones can be survived and transformed into purpose.
Tyler visits me every other weekend, now 12 years old and thriving in his foster placement.
He's grown into a thoughtful, kind young man who understands that his mother's actions were wrong, but that she was still his mother. What about Dad? Kevin's situation was more complicated because his participation in a conspiracy had been less direct but more personal. He'd been willing to use his mother's supposed mental decline to justify taking control of her life, even if he hadn't known about Linda's poisoning. Your father made choices that hurt me and destroyed our family, I said.
Whether I ever have a relationship with him again will depend on whether he learns from those choices and becomes someone I can trust to prioritize my well-being over his financial interests.
These conversations with Tyler reminded me constantly that the consequences of family betrayal extend far beyond the immediate victims.
Children lose their sense of security when they discover that their parents are capable of harming grandparents they love.
Trust in family relationships is damaged for generations when criminal behavior destroys the foundation of what should be unconditional love and support.
But Tyler also reminded me that healing is possible, that young people are resilient, and that positive relationships can be rebuilt even after devastating betrayal if people are committed to honesty, respect, and putting others' needs ahead of their own desires.
As I finish this story, I'm 77 years old, in excellent health despite Linda's attempts to damage it, and living exactly the life I choose to live in the house they tried to steal from me.
The tea service in my kitchen has been replaced with a coffee station where elderly visitors can relax while we discuss their protection strategies and legal rights.
The dining room where Kevin and Linda used to pressure me about assisted living has become a meeting space where families learn to have honest conversations about aging, independence, and mutual support. Most importantly, the house that was supposed to become their inheritance when they'd eliminated me has become a resource for helping other elderly people protect themselves from family predators.
Linda is serving her 25-year sentence at a women's correctional facility, where she's apparently enrolled in drug rehabilitation programs and counseling for people who've committed crimes against family members.
Kevin is serving his 8-year sentence at a different facility, where he's reportedly working in the prison library and taking correspondence courses in social work. Amy and Robert have already been released after serving their shorter sentences, but they've made no attempt to contact me or rebuild any kind of relationship. All of them are permanently excluded from my will, which now designates that my house and assets will support the Foundation's work and provide resources for Tyler's education and future needs. The tea they used to poison me has been replaced with relationships that nourish my spirit, work that gives my life meaning, and the satisfaction of knowing that their betrayal was transformed into protection for other people facing similar threats. They tried to feed me poison disguised as love and concern. Instead, they fed themselves a dose of karma that will last for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the best revenge isn't planning elaborate schemes to destroy your enemies. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to drink the poison they're trying to feed you, and then watching as their own actions create consequences they never anticipated. My name is Dorothy Churn, and they poisoned my food thinking I was too old and trusting to fight back. But they ate the karma instead, and it tasted exactly as bitter as the poison they'd tried to serve me. Thank you for joining us for this Justice Tales masterpiece. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who believes that trust should be earned, that family should protect rather than prey on each other, and that sometimes the most dangerous meal is the one prepared by people who smile while they serve it. Remember, trust your instincts about people's motivations, document suspicious behavior, and never let anyone convince you that accepting abuse is the same as maintaining family relationships. Until next time, this is Justice Tales, where karma serves the perfect meal to people who try to poison others, and where every victim has the power to transform betrayal into protection for those who come after.